The story unfolds in the heart of a medium-sized city in the United States, a place where the surface often hides deep-rooted tensions. On the surface, it seems like a typical American town. Tree-lined streets, bustling downtown markets, and a mix of old brick buildings alongside modern architecture. However, beneath the image of suburban normalcy, there's a long history of racial inequality. Tensions between the predominantly white police force and the black community have simmered for decades, manifesting in small but constant acts of distrust and discrimination. Many residents, particularly those in marginalized neighborhoods, have learned to live cautiously, aware that justice doesn't always extend equally across racial lines. John Reynolds, a white police officer in his early 40s, is a product of this environment. He's been a cop for over 15 years, proudly following in the footsteps of his father, who was also a police officer. John is solidly built, his graying hair cropped short, with a sharp, weathered face that rarely breaks into a smile. He's a man of few words, and though his colleagues respect him for his no-nonsense attitude, they also know he harbors biases, prejudices that were ingrained in him from a young age, growing up in a blue-collar, all-white neighborhood where suspicion of people of color was the norm. John sees himself as a good cop, doing what's necessary to maintain law and order, but his views are clouded by a lifetime of unchecked racism. On the other side of town, Dr. Marcus Carter represents a very different experience of America. Marcus, a tall and dignified black man in his late 30s, with neatly trimmed hair and a refined sense of style, is a well-respected physician. He's built a successful career, specializing in pediatric surgery, and his reputation extends far beyond the hospital walls. Despite his professional achievements, Marcus has never been able to escape the subtle and overt acts of racism that have followed him throughout his life. Born and raised in a lower-income black neighborhood, he fought against the odds, excelling academically and socially. He's known for his work with underprivileged children and is often invited to speak at conferences and medical forums. Marcus lives in a well-off neighborhood now, but he's fully aware that no matter how much success he achieves, society often sees him first as a black man, not a doctor. The stage is set. Two men. One, a seasoned police officer whose worldview is shaped by fear and prejudice. The other, a successful black man who has worked tirelessly to rise above the limitations society has imposed on him, are about to cross paths in a way that will change their lives forever. It was a bright, sunny afternoon when Marcus Carter got into his car, a sleek black Mercedes-Benz, and headed towards the city center. He had a conference to attend, where he was scheduled to give a keynote address on pediatric surgery. As he drove through the affluent, predominantly white neighborhood, his mind was focused on his speech. The street was quiet, with only a few cars moving about, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling of unease that often followed him when he drove through areas like this. He had lived with it for as long as he could remember, an unspoken tension that arose simply because of the color of his skin. As Marcus approached a stop sign, a patrol car appeared in his rearview mirror. He glanced at it briefly, hoping it would continue on its way, but when the flashing red and blue lights suddenly turned on, his heart sank. He pulled over, taking a deep breath as the police cruiser slowed to a stop behind him. Officer John Reynolds sat behind the wheel, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel as he looked at the car in front of him. The luxury vehicle had caught his attention immediately, and when he saw who was driving it, his suspicions were confirmed in his mind. A black man, driving an expensive car, in this neighborhood. It didn't sit right with him. John had handled countless stops like this before, and experience told him that something wasn't adding up. Probably drugs or stolen, he muttered to himself as he grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the patrol car. Marcus watched in his side mirror as the officer approached, his heart racing. He rolled down the window, trying to stay calm, but the tension was already thick. John leaned down, his hand resting on his holster as he peered inside the car. "License and registration," he demanded curtly, his tone devoid of any politeness. Marcus nodded, trying to maintain his composure. "Sure, officer. Is there a problem?" John's eyes narrowed, scanning Marcus's face before flicking towards the back seat. "We'll see. Step out of the vehicle." The request immediately put Marcus on edge. "Is there a reason I need to step out, officer? I'm on my way to a conference. I haven't done anything wrong." John's jaw tightened. I said step out of the vehicle. Now. Marcus hesitated, knowing that refusing could escalate things. Reluctantly, he unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door, stepping out onto the sidewalk. He could feel eyes on him. People in nearby houses watching from behind curtains, and he hated it. Hated how easily he was being reduced to nothing more than a suspect, simply because of who he was and the car he drove. John circled around him, eyeing him up and down, already convinced that he was hiding something. Marcus stood there, his hands slightly trembling but his face calm. He had been through similar situations before, but something about the way this officer was treating him felt different, more aggressive, more personal. The encounter had begun, and Marcus could feel the weight of what was about to happen pressing down on him. As Marcus stood by his car, he could feel the tension rising with each passing second. Officer John Reynolds was circling him like a predator assessing its prey, his eyes filled with suspicion and an underlying anger that Marcus had seen too many times before. The officer's hand remained dangerously close to his holstered weapon, a silent reminder of who held the power in this interaction. "Hands on the car," John barked. Marcus tensed. "Why?" "Officer, I haven't done anything wrong," he replied, his voice firm but respectful. "I'm a doctor. I have a conference to attend." "Hands on the car," John shouted, stepping closer, his chest puffed out in a show of dominance. "I don't care who you are or where you're going," I said. "Hands on the car." The volume of the officer's voice drew the attention of a couple walking their dog across the street. They stopped, watching the scene unfold. Marcus felt his stomach churn as he saw them pull out their phones, recording. He could sense how easily this situation could spiral, and all he wanted was to de-escalate before it was too late. "I don't see why this is necessary," Marcus said, trying to stay calm as he placed his hands on the hood of the car. "Can we please keep this civil? I have my license, my registration." John cut him off sharply. "Civility, huh? You want to talk about civility? Driving through here in this car, acting like you own the place. What's in the trunk? Drugs? Stolen goods? Huh?" Marcus felt a wave of frustration rise inside him. "Officer, this is ridiculous. You're making assumptions about me based on nothing," John sneered, pulling out his flashlight and shining it into the car. "Nothing? I've been on this job long enough to know when something doesn't feel right. Guys like you," he paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. "You always think you're above the law, but not today." The implication in John's tone was clear. Marcus was no longer just a driver on his way to work. He was being reduced to a stereotype, an enemy in the eyes of a system that had long painted black men as threats. His pulse quickened, but he forced himself to breathe slowly. He had learned, painfully, that any sign of defiance could be seen as resistance. "Look, officer," Marcus said, his voice measured, "I'm not trying to cause any trouble. I'm just asking that you treat me with the same respect you would anyone else." John's eyes flared with anger, his grip on the flashlight tightening. "Respect? You don't get to ask for respect when you're being suspicious." He took a step closer, invading Marcus's personal space. "Now, if you know what's good for you, you'll shut your mouth and let me do my job." Before Marcus could respond, John grabbed his arm and yanked it behind his back. The sudden move caused a ripple of pain through Marcus's shoulder. "Hey, that's unnecessary," Marcus protested, but John was already shoving him face first onto the hood of the car. His cheek pressed against the cold metal. Marcus felt a surge of humiliation. The heat of anger and shame washed over him, but he knew better than to struggle. "You're hurting me," he said through gritted teeth, his voice barely above a whisper. John didn't respond. Instead, he cuffed Marcus's wrists tightly, as if trying to prove a point. The sound of the metal clicking shut around his wrists echoed in Marcus's ears, a harsh reminder that, in this moment, all his accomplishments, his respect in the medical community, his success, none of it mattered. To this officer, he was nothing more than a suspect. The crowd of onlookers had grown, and more people were filming. Marcus could hear their murmurs of disbelief and concern. He wanted to scream, to shout that this was wrong, but he knew that would only make things worse. John stood back, looking down at his work, his breathing heavy. "Stay there," he growled, as if Marcus had a choice. Then, he walked back toward his patrol car to run the plates, completely unaware, or perhaps unconcerned, that his actions were being broadcast to the world in real time. Marcus closed his eyes, his heart pounding. The situation had spiraled completely out of control, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As Marcus lay face down on the hood of his car, hands cuffed behind his back, the weight of the situation bore down on him. The humiliation was overwhelming. Here he was, a man who had spent his life helping others, being treated like a common criminal in broad daylight. His mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. He had done everything right. He had complied, stayed calm, and tried to explain. Yet none of it mattered. Around him, the scene was quickly turning into a spectacle. A small crowd had gathered, murmurs of disbelief spreading among them. Phones were out, capturing every second. Marcus could feel the heat of shame rising in his chest as he imagined how this footage would be shared online. A successful black man, reduced to a helpless figure in handcuffs by an officer who couldn't see beyond the color of his skin. "Is this really necessary?" someone in the crowd called out, but John ignored them. He was focused on running Marcus's information through the system, convinced that he would find something, anything, to justify his actions. In his mind, he was still right. This was just another traffic stop gone routine, another arrest waiting to be made. But for Marcus, it was much more than that. Marcus heard a voice nearby, soft but filled with concern. "Are you okay, sir?" a woman asked. She was standing on the sidewalk, her phone still recording. Marcus turned his head slightly, meeting her eyes. He wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he just nodded weakly, though he felt far from okay. The crowd was no longer just witnesses. They were now participants, each one of them silently recording and amplifying the moment that would define his day, perhaps his life. Meanwhile, John was pacing by his patrol car, waiting for the results of the background check. The air around him was tense, but he barely noticed. To him, this was just another day at work. "This guy probably thinks he's untouchable," John muttered under his breath, glancing over at Marcus with disdain. In his mind, a black man in an expensive car in a white neighborhood was enough reason for suspicion. Back on the car, Marcus's thoughts were a storm. His face pressed against the metal hood. He could feel every eye on him, every camera focused on his degradation, his entire identity, everything he had worked for. His years of education, his medical career, his reputation, none of it protected him from this. It didn't matter that he was Dr. Marcus Carter, the highly respected surgeon. Right now, in the eyes of this officer, and perhaps in the eyes of some of the people watching, he was just another black man in handcuffs. And that was all that seemed to matter. The crowd was growing restless, the tension palpable. "This is wrong," a man shouted from behind a phone camera. "You can't just treat him like that." Another voice piped up, "That's Dr. Carter. What the hell is going on here?" John's radio crackled to life, interrupting the rising chorus of voices. "All clear," the dispatcher's voice came through. "No warrants, clean record. He's legit." John's face tightened, a flash of surprise crossing his features. His preconceived notions began to unravel, but rather than admit his mistake, he doubled down. "Stay out of it," he growled, turning to the growing group of bystanders. His frustration was mounting as the realization set in that there was nothing. No criminal record, no outstanding warrants, nothing to validate the aggressive stop. Marcus, his hands still cuffed, remained silent, but his heart was pounding. He knew what was happening now. His innocence wasn't a surprise to him, of course, but the humiliation of the situation was. His body tensed as he tried to find some semblance of dignity, even in this degrading position. He wasn't just being humiliated. He was being dehumanized, stripped of his achievements, his respect, and his autonomy, all because of a racial bias that had clouded John's judgment from the moment he saw him. The crowd was growing more vocal. Someone stepped forward, phone raised, filming the scene directly in John's face. "Let him go," they shouted, the command echoed by several others. The public pressure was mounting, and for the first time, John seemed to waver. He had lost control of the situation. Marcus kept his eyes focused straight ahead, his face burning with shame, But inside, a fire was growing. He wasn't just going to let this go. This wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had been in his position. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, and he knew that his response to this moment mattered. How he reacted now could shape the outcome, not just for himself, but for others who might face the same injustice. The weight of the situation was palpable as the small crowd murmured among themselves, with more people stopping to watch what had now become a public spectacle. John Reynolds, standing by his patrol car, felt the tension in the air but refused to acknowledge that anything was wrong. His face hardened as he processed the clean background check that had just come through on his radio. No criminal record, no outstanding warrants, nothing suspicious. Still, John wasn't ready to back down. He was too deep into his assumptions, too sure that something had to be wrong. At that moment, a second patrol car pulled up to the scene. The new officer, David Martinez, was a young Latino cop who had been on the force for only a few years. He immediately noticed the crowd, the phones recording, and the tension in the air. Walking briskly toward John, he glanced at Marcus, who was still handcuffed against the hood of his car, then turned to his superior with a confused look. "What's going on here?" David asked, his voice low but urgent, trying not to make the situation any worse in front of the gathering crowd. John, still visibly agitated, motioned toward Marcus. "Traffic stop. Suspicious behavior. We're handling it." David's eyes flicked back to Marcus, and something about the man's demeanor struck him as familiar. He had seen Marcus before, somewhere. It wasn't uncommon for people to claim to be someone important when they got into trouble, but this felt different. David squinted as recognition slowly dawned on him. "Wait, that's Dr. Marcus Carter, isn't it?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. John's brow furrowed. "Who?" David turned to John, his voice urgent but controlled. "Dr. Carter. He's a prominent surgeon. He's been on the news before. He's kind of a big deal around here." For the first time since the stop began, John faltered. He looked at Marcus, then back at David, as if struggling to process the new information. "You're telling me this guy is some kind of doctor?" he asked, his tone defensive. "Yes," David replied quickly. "He's well known. I've seen him at charity events and in the local news for his work with underprivileged kids." John's mind raced, his assumptions crashing against the reality that was now being thrust upon him. The man he had roughly pinned to the hood of a car wasn't some nameless suspect. He wasn't a criminal. He was a respected figure in the community, a man who likely had connections and influence far beyond anything John had imagined. The implications hit him like a cold wave, and for a moment, he stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. Marcus, hearing the exchange, turned his head slightly. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with a quiet fury. "I told you who I am," he said softly, though his words carried weight. "But you didn't want to listen." John's mouth tightened. The officer felt the weight of the crowd's eyes, the cell phone still recording, and the judgment that was sure to follow. But instead of backing down, he doubled down, his pride refusing to let him admit that he had made a mistake. "I was following procedure," John muttered defensively, still not fully relinquishing control. "You looked suspicious." "Suspicious?" Marcus repeated, his voice tinged with bitterness. "Suspicious because I'm a black man in a nice car?" The accusation hung in the air, heavy with truth. The crowd, now fully engaged, watched closely, waiting for John's response. David shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware of how bad the situation had become. He stepped forward, lowering his voice so only John could hear. "You need to release him. Now." John hesitated, but the reality of the situation was sinking in fast. He couldn't keep Marcus in cuffs, not after what David had just revealed. Not with the crowd recording every second. Begrudgingly, he moved toward Marcus, taking out his keys with a scowl etched across his face. Marcus stood still, his hands still behind his back, as John unlocked the handcuffs. The metal fell away, and Marcus slowly straightened up, his wrists sore and his pride wounded. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, a mixture of sympathy and outrage in their expressions. John took a step back, feeling exposed in front of the gathering of bystanders. His jaw clenched as he tried to find the right words to say. something that would salvage the situation. "I was just doing my job," he muttered, almost to himself, but loud enough for Marcus to hear. Marcus turned slowly, locking eyes with John. "Doing your job?" he repeated, his voice filled with disbelief. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to humiliate and dehumanize." John looked away, his face tightening with discomfort. The crowd had grown silent, the tension palpable. He knew he had lost control of the situation, and no words could undo what had just happened. David, sensing that the scene was on the verge of boiling over, stepped in. "Dr. Carter, I'm deeply sorry for this," he said, his voice steady and sincere. "This shouldn't have happened." Marcus looked at David, his expression still hard, but he nodded slightly in acknowledgement. The anger inside him was still raw, but at least someone had acknowledged the wrong. The situation could have ended there, with Marcus free but deeply scarred by the experience. But the story was far from over. What had happened in those few minutes was already spreading, and the consequences would soon ripple far beyond that quiet suburban street. As John Reynolds stood there, the weight of his actions began to sink in deeper. The noise of the crowd, the flashes of phone cameras, the disapproving glares, they all faded into a distant hum as his mind spiraled into a quiet, personal turmoil. He had made a serious mistake, and for the first time in his career, he felt the full weight of that realization pressing down on him like a heavy, invisible hand. For years, John had operated under a certain set of beliefs, many of them inherited from his father, a tough, no-nonsense cop who had always seen the world in black and white. "You can't trust them," his father used to say, usually referring to black men. "They'll always try to get one over on you." Growing up in a predominantly white, working-class neighborhood, John had never questioned those lessons. His experiences on the force only seemed to reinforce them. Every time he pulled over a black driver or responded to a call in a black neighborhood, it was as if his father's words were proven true, validating the cycle of suspicion and fear that had been passed down to him. But now, as he stood there, watching Dr. Marcus Carter rub his sore wrists and straighten his suit jacket, those long-held beliefs felt fragile, even dangerous. What if he had been wrong all along? What if his entire approach to policing, his quick judgments, his aggressive tactics, had been warped by bias? John's stomach twisted at the thought. He had always prided himself on being a good cop, someone who protected his community. But in this moment, he wasn't so sure anymore. David's words echoed in his mind. He's a prominent surgeon. John couldn't shake it. A doctor, a man who saved lives, who was respected by the community, someone who did real good in the world. And John had treated him like a criminal purely because of the color of his skin and the car he drove. The realization gnawed at him. The crowd began to disperse slowly, their phones still recording, likely uploading footage to social media as they walked away. John felt the eyes of those who remained on him, each gaze a silent indictment. He shifted uncomfortably, his hands twitching by his sides. He wanted to say something, anything, to make the situation better, but no words came. Everything he had built his professional life on was crumbling, and he had no idea how to respond. "Reynolds," David said quietly, his voice breaking through John's inner turmoil. "We need to talk." John swallowed hard, nodding. "Yeah," he muttered, though his mind was miles away. They walked a few paces away from the remaining crowd, but the atmosphere between them was tense. "Look, I know this doesn't sit well with you," David began cautiously, "but you've got to face the fact that this wasn't just a mistake. This was a result of how you view people like Dr. Carter." John bristled at the comment. "People like Dr. Carter?" he shot back defensively, though he knew what David meant. "Black men," David said plainly. "You assumed he was a criminal from the moment you saw him. You didn't even give him a chance. You jumped to conclusions based on race, not facts." John felt a surge of anger rise in him, but it quickly faded into something more complicated. His defensiveness melted away, replaced by a deep, unsettling sense of guilt. He couldn't deny it. He had judged Marcus the second he saw him. The man's skin color, his expensive car, the neighborhood they were in. It had all lined up in John's mind as suspicious without a second thought. He had acted on instinct, But now he was beginning to see that those instincts had been poisoned by years of bias. I didn't mean for it to go like this," John said quietly, his voice lacking the usual authority it carried. It was the closest thing to an apology he could muster, though even he knew it wasn't enough. David sighed, crossing his arms. "I get it, man. We're all a product of the world we come from. But that doesn't excuse what happened here. You've got to start asking yourself some hard questions, John, about why you see certain people the way you do. Because this," David gestured toward Marcus, who was talking to a sympathetic bystander. "This can't happen again." John nodded, though the gesture felt hollow. He knew David was right, but it wasn't just about asking hard questions. It was about confronting the reality that his entire worldview, the way he approached his job, the way he saw the world, was fundamentally flawed. And that was terrifying. Marcus's words from earlier echoed in his mind. Your job is to protect and serve, not to humiliate and dehumanize. The truth in those words stung. He had failed, not just Marcus, but the oath he had taken when he joined the force. As David walked back toward the patrol car, John remained where he was, his eyes fixed on Marcus. He wanted to approach him, to say something, anything, that might make it right. But what could he possibly say? The damage was done, and no amount of words could erase the humiliation and pain he had caused. For the first time in his career, John Reynolds felt small. He felt powerless in the face of his own ignorance, and the weight of that realization was almost unbearable. As Marcus stood beside his car, rubbing his wrists where the cuffs had dug into his skin, a wave of conflicting emotions washed over him. The physical pain was minor compared to the deeper wound, one that wasn't just skin deep. His mind was swirling, a mixture of anger, humiliation, and something far more painful, exhaustion. He had worked so hard his entire life to prove that he was more than the color of his skin, and yet here he was, laid bare by an officer's prejudice in front of a crowd of strangers. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady his breathing. The crowd had thinned, but a few concerned faces remained. A woman approached him hesitantly, her voice soft. "Dr. Carter, are you okay? That was so wrong what they did." Marcus forced a small, tight smile, though his heart wasn't in it. "Thank you. I'll be fine," he said, his voice calm but detached. He appreciated the concern, but at this moment, he didn't want anyone's pity. He wanted to disappear, to retreat from the spotlight of this public humiliation. But the incident wasn't something that would fade easily. He knew the videos being uploaded, the whispers of those who watched, and the systemic reality that he had faced today were all part of a larger issue. This wasn't just about him. It was about all the people who didn't have the privileges he did, who faced this kind of abuse daily with no one to film or hold the system accountable. As he stood there, Marcus's thoughts turned inward, to his childhood. He remembered his father, a hard-working man who had done everything in his power to protect his son from the racism he knew would come. "You'll have to work twice as hard to get half as much respect," his father had told him when he was a boy, advice that Marcus had carried with him every step of the way. And so he had worked, endlessly, to prove himself, to rise above the limitations that society had placed on him because of his skin color. He had gone to the best schools, graduated top of his class, and become a respected surgeon. But no matter how high he climbed, moments like this dragged him back down. Moments like this reminded him that, to some, he would always just be another black man in America. Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he took out his phone, looking at the time. He had missed the beginning of the medical conference where he was supposed to speak. He was supposed to stand in front of an audience of his peers and talk about the latest advancements in pediatric surgery, about saving lives. But instead, he was here, fighting a battle he thought he had left behind. The irony wasn't lost on him. "I'm so sorry, Marcus," David, the younger officer, said as he approached cautiously. His voice was filled with genuine remorse. "I tried to tell him, but," he trailed off, unsure of how to finish that sentence. "How do you justify what just happened?" Marcus looked at David, and for a moment, he saw the man for what he was, a cog in a machine much bigger than him, trying to do the right thing in a system that so often made it impossible. Marcus's anger wasn't directed at David. Not really. It wasn't even solely directed at John Reynolds, though his actions had sparked the fire. It was directed at the entire system that allowed, even encouraged, these kinds of encounters to happen. "I know," Marcus said, his voice quiet but firm, "but this isn't just about today. It's about every day." His eyes flicked to the side, where John stood awkwardly by his patrol car, staring at the ground. "He's not the only one who needs to learn that," David nodded. But there was nothing else to say. He knew Marcus was right. The younger officer turned to walk back to the patrol car, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. Marcus watched him go, his jaw clenched tightly. His mind wandered back to the patients he treated. Young, innocent children who had no idea about the world that awaited them, especially those who looked like him. He thought about the kids he had saved, their families who had thanked him, and how none of that mattered in moments like these. For all his success, for all the lives he'd touched, Marcus was still vulnerable to the same prejudices and systemic failures that plagued the lives of black men in America every day. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking his train of thought. It was a message from the hospital, probably wondering where he was. Marcus didn't respond. Instead, he stood in silence for a moment longer, feeling the weight of the cuffs on his wrists even though they were no longer there. But he knew what he had to do next. This incident couldn't just be swept under the rug. He had the means, the voice, and the platform to ensure that what happened to him wouldn't be forgotten. His personal humiliation would have to serve a greater purpose. He couldn't just let this slide, for himself or for the countless others who couldn't fight back. He pulled out his phone again, but this time it wasn't to check the time. He began scrolling through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for. A prominent civil rights attorney who had long been a friend of the family. Marcus pressed the call button and brought the phone to his ear, his face hardening with resolve. "We need to talk," he said when the attorney answered. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Within hours of the incident, the videos taken by bystanders began circulating on social media. The shaky footage captured everything. The aggressive stop, the shouting, the moment Marcus was slammed onto the hood of his car, and the stunned crowd recording the scene. By the next morning, the story had gone viral. Hashtags like #JusticeForDrCarter and #racial profiling were trending across platforms, and what had started as a local incident had gained national attention. Marcus hadn't anticipated how quickly the public would react. But now, sitting in his office, his phone buzzed constantly with notifications. Messages from colleagues, friends, and reporters filled his inbox. The hospital administration had already reached out, offering their support and asking if he needed time off. The media was relentless, with requests for interviews piling up. It felt surreal. Less than 24 hours ago, he had been humiliated on the side of the road, and now, he was the center of a national conversation. But Marcus wasn't interested in fame. He wasn't interested in becoming the face of a movement, at least not initially. What he wanted was justice, not just for himself, but for everyone who had endured similar experiences without the benefit of viral videos and public outrage. He thought about all the people who had been in his position but hadn't had the platform or visibility to fight back. Sitting at his desk, Marcus scrolled through social media, watching as the story gained traction. He saw the video reposted with angry captions, comments flooding in from people across the country. The anger was palpable. People were fed up with seeing black men like Marcus treated as suspects first and human beings second. The narrative was already forming. Another example of police racism. Another innocent man brutalized by those meant to protect. And while Marcus appreciated the support, he couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. This wasn't just about him anymore. It had become a flashpoint in the ongoing national conversation about race and policing. As much as he wanted to retreat and focus on his work, he knew that this moment required more from him. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Marcus looked up to see his longtime colleague, Dr. Sarah Middleton, standing in the doorway. She was one of his closest friends at the hospital, and her expression was a mix of concern and sympathy. "I saw the video," she said softly, stepping inside. "Marcus, I'm so sorry. I can't believe this happened." Marcus sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Neither can I. But here we are." Sarah sat down across from him, her eyes searching his face for a hint of how he was really feeling. "What are you going to do?" she asked after a pause. "I've already spoken with a lawyer," Marcus replied. "This can't go unchallenged." I can't let them just brush it off like a misunderstanding. Sarah nodded. You're right. And you know the hospital is behind you. Everyone's talking about it. I appreciate that, Marcus said. But this is bigger than just what happened to me. This is about systemic racism. This is about how black men are treated in this country. It's not just a bad cop or a bad day. It's the entire system that lets this happen over and over. The anger in his voice was controlled but clear. He wasn't just upset about the incident. He was furious about the pattern, about how many times he had heard stories like his and how, despite all his success, it had happened to him too. He had fought so hard to rise above the limitations placed on him by society, only to be reminded in the most public way that, in many people's eyes, he was still just another black man to be feared. Sarah reached out, placing a hand on his arm. You're right, Marcus. This is important. And if anyone can make a difference, it's you. People are listening now. Marcus nodded, appreciating her support. I know, he said. That's why I have to keep pushing. I've spent my life helping others, saving lives in the operating room. But now I have to fight outside of it too. By the end of the day, the media had picked up the story in full force. Major news outlets were covering it, and cable news was running segments on the incident. The footage of Marcus being handcuffed and slammed onto the car was played over and over, accompanied by panel discussions about race and policing in America. Activist groups reached out to Marcus, offering to help organize protests and marches in support of his case. Civil rights organizations were issuing statements, calling for an investigation into the police department. Meanwhile, the local police department was facing a barrage of criticism. The department released a statement saying they were conducting an internal review of the incident, but the vague language only seemed to fuel more anger. Protesters began to gather outside the police station, demanding accountability and real change. For John Reynolds, the fallout was swift and unforgiving. He was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation, but the damage to his reputation had already been done. Social media was flooded with calls for his firing, and his name had become synonymous with everything wrong with policing in America. John, who had once prided himself on being a tough but fair officer, was now the face of racial profiling. As protests swelled and the media attention grew, Marcus found himself at the center of something much bigger than just his personal experience. This was about justice, not only for him but for every black person who had been wronged by the very people who were supposed to protect them. But the road ahead would be long, and Marcus knew that while the public outcry was loud now, the real challenge would be sustaining the pressure. He was ready, though. This fight wasn't just his. It was a fight for the future, for a world where men like him wouldn't have to fear for their lives during a routine traffic stop. The media frenzy had brought John Reynolds and Marcus Carter back into the same room. This time, not on the side of a busy street, but in the sterile conference room of a lawyer's office. The walls were plain, the table polished, and the tension so thick it felt like another presence in the room. Marcus sat across from John, his face calm but his posture tense. John, on the other hand, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes darting around the room as if trying to find something, anything, to focus on besides the man he had wronged. Between them sat two attorneys, Marcus's civil rights lawyer, a sharp-eyed black woman named Monica Johnson, and the police union's lawyer, an older white man with a perpetual frown etched into his face. The air conditioning hummed softly in the background, a small, constant noise that did nothing to break the uncomfortable silence that had settled between the four. Monica was the first to speak, her voice steady and authoritative. We're here today because what happened was not just a mistake. It was a clear violation of Dr. Carter's rights, and we intend to hold those responsible accountable. John swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had replayed the incident over and over in his mind for days, and every time, the conclusion was the same. He had been wrong. Yet, sitting here, the weight of that admission was crushing. He had been a cop for 15 years, and now, he was the subject of a public investigation, the target of protests, in the face of a viral video that painted him as a symbol of everything wrong with law enforcement. He had always believed in the righteousness of his actions, but now that belief was cracking under the strain of public scrutiny and personal guilt. Monica continued, her gaze never wavering. Before we move forward with legal action, Dr. Carter has agreed to this meeting. He wants an explanation. He wants to know why this happened. All eyes turned to John, and the pressure was unbearable. He cleared his throat, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. He had never been good with words, especially when it came to confronting his own failures. He took a breath and looked directly at Marcus, who sat silently, his face unreadable. I was doing my job, John began, his voice low and rough. I thought, he hesitated, unsure of how to explain what he had done without making it worse. I thought something was off. I made a judgment based on what I saw. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly, but he remained silent. He wanted to hear John out, even though the words felt hollow. John continued, stumbling over his own reasoning. You were driving an expensive car, in a neighborhood where it didn't seem like you belonged. He winced as the words left his mouth, realizing too late how terrible they sounded. Monica's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't speak. This was Marcus's moment, and she wouldn't interrupt. Marcus finally leaned forward, his voice calm but filled with barely suppressed anger. Didn't seem like I belonged? He repeated, the words sharp in the quiet room. Because I'm a black man in a nice car? John felt a wave of shame wash over him. No, that's not. Well, yes, I guess that's part of it, he admitted, his voice faltering. I've made stops like that before, and sometimes it turns out bad. I thought this was one of those times. Marcus shook his head slowly, incredulity flashing across his face. You assumed I was a criminal because of the color of my skin and the car I was driving. You didn't ask any questions. You didn't try to understand. You just saw a black man and made up your mind. John's hands clenched tighter, his knuckles white. I didn't mean for it to go that way. I wasn't trying to hurt you. But you did, Marcus shot back, his voice rising. You humiliated me. You treated me like I was nothing. Like everything I've worked for, everything I've accomplished, didn't matter the moment you laid eyes on me. Do you have any idea what that feels like? John's eyes dropped to the table. I don't, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what it's like. The silence that followed was heavy, the words hanging in the air between them. Marcus could see the regret in John's face, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. I'm a doctor, Marcus said, his voice tight with emotion. I save lives. I've spent my entire life trying to prove that I'm more than what people see when they look at me. And in one moment, you reduced me to nothing. You made me feel powerless. John nodded, the weight of Marcus's words crashing into him. I was wrong, he said, his voice cracking with emotion. I know that now. I let my prejudices get the better of me. I've been on the force for a long time, and I've seen things that have shaped the way I see people. But that's not an excuse. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. Marcus stared at him for a long moment, the apology hanging between them like a fragile thread. It wasn't enough to erase the pain, the humiliation, or the public spectacle that had followed, but it was something. He wasn't sure if he could ever fully forgive John, but he had heard the words he needed to hear. Monica cleared her throat, breaking the silence. Dr. Carter, this meeting was a chance for Officer Reynolds to explain his actions. But as we move forward, we will continue to seek accountability. Marcus nodded, his gaze still fixed on John. This isn't just about me, he said quietly. It's about the system that allows this to happen. I can't let this go. John's face tightened, but he nodded. He knew that Marcus was right. This wasn't just about one bad judgment call. It was about a system that had allowed him to make that call in the first place. He had to confront his own biases, but more than that, he knew the system needed to change. He had never thought about it before, not really. But now, sitting across from Marcus, he couldn't deny it any longer. As the meeting came to a close, both men stood. Marcus extended his hand, and John hesitated for a moment before taking it. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step, a small, tentative step towards something better. The road ahead was long, and the fight was far from over, but for Marcus and John, this confrontation was a moment of reckoning, a chance to confront not just each other but the deep-seated issues that had brought them to this moment. As the door to the conference room closed behind them, Marcus Carter walked out into the bright sunlight, feeling the weight of the encounter still lingering. The apology had been given, but it hadn't erased the damage. No amount of regret from John Reynolds would fully take away the hurt, the humiliation, or the reminder that, even with all of his success, he was still vulnerable to the same racial biases that had haunted him his entire life. Yet, despite the pain, Marcus felt a strange sense of clarity. The encounter had pushed him into a fight he hadn't expected, but one that felt inevitable. As he walked to his car, Marcus thought about the responsibility he now carried. His experience had been publicized. People were watching, listening. They wanted to see what he would do next. The platform wasn't something he had asked for, but now that it was in his hands, he knew he had to use it. The protests outside the police department were growing by the day. Crowds gathered, chanting for justice, for accountability, for reform. Signs bearing his name, "Justice for Dr. Carter," were held high, and social media was flooded with calls for action. Civil rights organizations were reaching out to him daily, asking how they could support him, how they could amplify his voice. Marcus had always been a man of action, but until now, his focus had been in the operating room, saving lives one surgery at a time. Now, he was stepping into a new role, one where his voice could help change the system that had wronged him. The department, too, was under immense pressure. The internal investigation into John Reynolds had begun, but the public wanted more than just disciplinary action. They wanted reform, tangible changes to a system that allowed racial profiling to persist. The police department, long resistant to admitting fault, was now being forced to confront its own failings. Leaders were issuing public statements, vowing to review their practices and provide more training to officers. But Marcus knew that wasn't enough. Training couldn't fix a system built on centuries of prejudice. As Marcus climbed into his car, his phone buzzed with another notification. A message from his lawyer, Monica Johnson. She was preparing to file a formal civil rights lawsuit, one that would challenge not just the actions of John Reynolds, but the policies and culture that allowed those actions to occur. Marcus had agreed to move forward with the lawsuit, not out of a desire for personal gain, but because he knew that his case could set a precedent. It could spark the changes that so many people in his position had been fighting for. But as he drove through the city, past the protesters and the reporters camped outside the police station, Marcus couldn't help but reflect on the broader picture. This fight wasn't just his. It belonged to the black men and women who faced the same fear and humiliation every day. It belonged to the parents who taught their children how to survive encounters with the police, not because they had done anything wrong, but because the system saw them as a threat simply for existing. For John Reynolds, the road ahead was also uncertain. Placed on indefinite leave, he had been left to confront his own actions in silence. The media had turned him into a villain, and he had no one to blame but himself. The truth was, John knew he deserved the scrutiny. His entire career had been built on assumptions and biases he hadn't questioned until now. But after the meeting with Marcus, something had shifted inside him. He had seen the human cost of his actions up close, and it had shaken him. Now, for the first time in his life, John was asking himself hard questions. Questions about race, about the system he had been a part of, and about how he could begin to change. As he sat at home, staring at the news coverage of the protests, John realized that he couldn't go back to the way things were. He couldn't just return to work and pretend that nothing had happened. He didn't know what the future held for him, but he knew that he had to confront his own racism and complicity. He had to acknowledge that his actions weren't isolated. They were part of a larger problem, one that wouldn't be solved with just an apology. For Marcus, the fight ahead was daunting, but he was ready. His role as a doctor would continue, but now, his voice would carry beyond the walls of the hospital. He would stand with the protesters, with the civil rights organizations, with everyone who believed in a better, more just system. He would use his platform to push for the reforms that were long overdue, not just to fix the system, but to rebuild it from the ground up. And for both men, the experience had left them changed. Marcus, though still carrying the weight of the trauma, had found a new purpose. John, though disgraced, had begun the long process of confronting his own biases. Neither man would forget what had happened, but in the aftermath, they would each move forward in their own way. The story of Marcus Carter and John Reynolds wasn't just about one incident. It was about a system, a country, and a reckoning long in the making. The battle for justice was far from over, but with each step, Marcus knew that he was part of something bigger, something that would outlast the headlines and the protests. It was a fight for dignity, for equality, and for a future where men like him wouldn't have to live in fear of the very people sworn to protect them. As he drove away from the city and into the quiet of the evening, Marcus knew that this was just the beginning. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and watch this next story. It's truly moving.